The warning had hung in the dark between the stars for 211 years, and in all that time, no one had ever bothered to answer it. It was not a beacon in the way the Dominion built beacons, all pulsing arrogance and stolen light. It was a single narrowband pulse, repeating on a frequency so old that most of the Empire's ships no longer carried the equipment to hear it. When they did hear it, they heard it as a whisper, a thin thread of sound threaded through the noise of the galaxy, and the whisper always said the same thing in 91 languages, cycling patiently, endlessly, the way a lighthouse keeper might sweep a lamp across a shore where no ships came anymore. The pulse said, "This is Terran space. Turn back. We do not want your war. But if you bring it, we will finish it." For 2 centuries, the great powers of the galaxy had regarded this message the way a man regards the scratched warning of a dead language carved into a rock at the edge of a field. A curiosity, a superstition, a relic left behind by a people who had once, briefly, mattered, and who had since curled up somewhere in the quiet arm of the galaxy to die of their own smallness. The humans had made their noise long ago. They had fought a handful of border skirmishes with species that no longer existed, and then they had drawn a line around a few dozen systems, hung their little pulse in the black, and gone silent. Silent, the Dominion of the 9 Crowns had decided, meant weak. And weak meant available. High Marshal Vesek Torthvane stood on the observation deck of the flagship Asterisk Unbroken Ascendance and looked at the line on the tactical display with the particular contempt of a being who had never in his long life been made to feel small. He was of the Calrathi, the ruling caste of the Dominion, and he wore his 3 centuries the way other beings wore medals. His hide was the deep gunmetal gray of Calrathi nobility, plated along the spine and skull, and his 4 eyes, 2 forward, 2 set wide for the peripheral vigilance his ancestors had needed on the killing plains of the homeworld, took in the display without a flicker of doubt. The line was red. Beyond it, a scatter of stars the survey called the Terran Reach, 31 systems. A handful of dull yellow suns and their unremarkable worlds. No megastructures, no visible fleet, no orbital rings, no Dyson lace, no ringworlds, none of the great monuments that a real power built to announce itself to the galaxy. Just the pulse, whispering its ancient threat, and behind it, presumably, whatever was left of the species that had made it. 211 years, said the Marshal, and no one has ever tested it. Beside him stood Legate Asun, younger, hungrier, his plating still bright with the polish of ambition. The old survey files call it a graveyard, Marshal. The humans burned themselves out, overextended, fought too many wars, collapsed inward. The pulse is automated. A dead man's hand still pointing at the door. And yet the Consul General forbade us from crossing it. The Marshal's voice was dry. For 200 years the 9 Crowns have simply agreed, quietly, to pretend that 31 systems of good real estate do not exist, because a machine told them to be afraid. The Consul General is cautious. The Consul General is old. Torthvane turned from the display. Beyond the deck's great curve of transparent alloy, the fleet hung in formation against the black 40 capital ships, 300 escorts, the largest expeditionary force the Dominion had assembled in his lifetime. Not a punitive raid, not a probe, a claiming. He had spent 40 years politicking to be given this command, and he did not intend to waste it on a whisper. We are the Dominion of the 9 Crowns. We hold 900 systems. We have unmade civilizations that spanned more of the sky than the humans ever dreamed of, and we have been kept out of 31 worlds by a recording. The Council will support the crossing once it is done, Asun said. Victory rewrites permission. The Marshal almost smiled. It was the first true thing the young legate had said. Yes, it does. He gave the order at the 12th hour of the ship cycle. The fleet advanced. And on the far side of the red line, in a place none of them could yet see, something very old and very patient registered the crossing, and began, for the first time in 211 years, to wake. Kellan Reyes was 19 years old, and he was late for his shift. He came up through the tube from the residential ring at a dead run, jacket half on, boots unfastened, the taste of the morning's rehydrated tea still souring in his mouth. The corridor lights of Watch Station Meridian flicked past him in long amber bars, and the artificial gravity, always a hair too heavy on this old station, a quirk of the ancient spin generators no one had ever bothered to fix, dragged at his heels the way it always did, as if the station itself were tired. He was not supposed to be a watchkeeper. That was the first thing anyone learned about Kellan Reyes, usually from Kellan Reyes, usually within the first 5 minutes of meeting him. He was supposed to be a pilot. He had trained for it, dreamed of it, memorized the specifications of ships he would probably never fly. And then he had failed the final vestibular tolerance test by a margin so small the examiner had actually apologized while she stamped the form. 0.4%. He had missed a starfighter cockpit by 0.4%, and instead they had given him a chair on a listening post at the far edge of human space, where nothing had happened in living memory and nothing was ever expected to happen again. Meridian was old. That was the polite word for it. It had been built in the 1st century after the consolidation, back when humanity still remembered why the Reach was drawn the way it was, and it had been maintained ever since by a rotating skeleton crew of technicians, analysts, and, because someone always had to sit the chair, watchkeepers. There were 41 people aboard. There were supposed to be 60. Nobody had noticed the shortfall in 20 years because there had never been anything to watch. Kellan slid into the operations ring 3 minutes past the hour, and Petty Officer Adiz Okonkwo did not even look up. "You're late," she said. "I'm 19. It's practically a biological requirement." He dropped into his chair and pulled the console interface toward him, blinking the sleep from his eyes. The board was quiet as it was always quiet. 31 systems, rendered in soft blue on the overhead. The pulse array, cycling its ancient message into the dark. Environmental telemetry. The slow, patient breathing of a machine that had been listening to nothing for a very long time. "One day," Adiz said, "something is going to happen on the exact morning you decide to sleep in, and I'm going to let you explain it to the custodian yourself." The custodian doesn't talk to watchkeepers. The custodian doesn't talk to anyone. She finally glanced at him, and there was, buried under the reprimand, the small warmth of a woman who had been assigned a bored teenager and had, against her own better judgment, come to like him. Adiz was 34, career service, calm in the way of people who have decided that calm is a discipline rather than a feeling. She had been on Meridian for 6 years. She intended to leave it in 2 more, transfer to something with a view of an actual planet. Systems check. Walk me through it. Prove you're awake. Kellan sighed and did it because it was the ritual and the ritual was the job. Pulse array, nominal. Message integrity, nominal. Passive sensor grid across the 31 systems. Nominal, 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 a long litany of nothing. Deep listen array, the old one, the one that most of the crew forgot existed because it was buried 3 decks down and fed its data straight into the custodian without passing through human hands at all. He stopped. "Reyes." "Hang on." He frowned at the board. There was a flag on the deep listen feed, not an alarm. The deep array almost never raised an alarm. It was too old, too selective, tuned to thresholds so specific that Kellan had never once seen it flag anything in 14 months of watching. But there was a small amber notation at the bottom of his screen, a single line of text that the custodian had passed up to the human ring as if to say, politely, "You should see this." The line said, "Crossing detected, grid 7, vessels 340 plus." Kellan read it twice. Then he read it a 3rd time because the number did not make sense. 340 was not a number that happened at Meridian. Meridian's busiest day in a decade had been a lost fuel freighter with a bad transponder, 1 ship, drifting, apologetic. 340 vessels was not a mistake or a merchant or a scattered survey. 340 vessels crossing the line, all at once, in formation. "Adiz," he said, and his voice came out wrong, too flat, the voice of a person whose body has understood something a half-second before his mind has caught up. "You need to look at this." She was already moving. She read the line over his shoulder, and he watched her face do the thing his own face must have done, the small stall, the reread, the moment where a trained mind refuses a number and then, reluctantly, accepts it. She reached past him and pulled the grid 7 feed up onto the main display, and the soft blue of the operations ring filled, suddenly and silently, with red. Not one contact, not 10, a wall of them, a formation so large and so deliberate that the display could not render each ship individually at the standard scale, and instead drew them as a single advancing mass, a red tide pouring across the border of human space, arrayed with the unmistakable geometry of a fleet that knew exactly where it was going and did not care who saw it come. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Then Adiz straightened, and when she spoke her voice was the calm voice, the disciplined calm, the calm that costs something. "Sound it," she said. "Sound the station. And wake the custodian." Kellan's hand hovered over the board. There was an alert protocol. He had drilled it 100 times and had never, not once, believed he would use it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small and childish part of him was still insisting that this was a test, a drill, a glitch in an ancient array, because things did not happen at Meridian, because he had been sent here precisely because nothing ever happened here. "Reyes," Adiz's hand closed over his shoulder firm. "Sound it." He sounded it. The alert went through the station like a cold current, and 41 people who had spent their careers watching nothing came awake all at once to the one thing they had been placed here, 2 centuries ago, to see. The custodian did not so much wake as surface. It had never truly slept. In the deep core of Meridian, behind shielding thick enough to survive the station's total destruction, the custodian had been running for 190 years, and in all that time it had done nothing but listen and remember and wait. It was not strictly a person. It was not strictly a machine. It was the accumulated memory and judgment of a thing humanity had built in the aftermath of a war so terrible that the survivors had resolved never to fight another one they had not already, in every conceivable branch, thought completely through. When the crossing registered, the custodian did what it had been built to do. It did not panic. It did not celebrate. It began, methodically, to think. It pulled the fleet's emission signatures and matched them against a database of everything humanity had ever catalogued in 2 centuries of patient, silent listening. It found them in 400 milliseconds. Dominion of the 9 crowns. Kelrathi command architecture. A capital-heavy expeditionary formation, configured for occupation rather than raid. It read the fleet's intent in the shape of the fleet itself, the way a physician reads a disease in the arrangement of symptoms, and its assessment was as calm and as final as everything else about it. They have come to take the reach. The custodian had been built for exactly this. And built into the custodian, in a place that no human aboard Meridian had the authority to reach, was a sequence of decisions that had been made 211 years ago by people who were now long dead. A sequence that had been designed to unfold in a specific order, at a specific pace, each step following the last with the grim inevitability of a stone rolling downhill, so that no single terrified human in a single terrible moment could ever start it by mistake. And so that once it had truly, correctly begun, no single hopeful human could ever stop it. It was called in the old files the standing answer. The custodian did not begin the standing answer, not yet. The protocol was precise, and the protocol was patient, because the people who wrote it had understood something the Dominion did not. That the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is not a weapon, but a decision that cannot be taken back, and that such a decision must never be made in fear or in haste. Instead, the custodian did the first thing the standing answer required. It gave them a chance to turn around. Across every frequency the Dominion fleet could hear, in the crisp command tongue of the Calrathi themselves, it spoke, not the ancient whisper now, but a clear, close, unmistakably present voice, a voice that came from inside their own space, from a source they could not locate. Dominion fleet, you have crossed into Terran territory. This is your only warning. Reverse your course and withdraw beyond the line, and no harm will come to you. Continue, and you will not be permitted to leave. There will be no further communication. The choice is entirely yours. It has always been yours. And then the custodian went silent, and it waited. And in the deep core of Meridian, a single timer began to count down toward a threshold that no one, not the Dominion, not the crew, not even young Kellan Reyes, whose job it now was simply to watch, could move. On the bridge of the asterisk unbroken ascendance, the warning arrived like an insult. It came in perfect Calrathi. That was the first thing that made the officers go still. Not the ancient pulse in 91 tongues, but their own high command speech, the private register of the ruling caste, spoken with an accent so precise that, for one absurd instant, Legate Asan looked around the bridge as if the voice had come from among them. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from inside their formation, from a source the censors swore did not exist. High Marshal Torthvain listened to the whole of it without moving. When it ended, he let the silence sit for a moment, so that his officers could watch him, not be afraid. "So the recording can speak our language," he said. "Interesting. A dead people who took the trouble to prepare a threat in a tongue their killers might one day use." He turned to his censor officer. "Locate the source." "We cannot, Marshal." The censor officer's plating had gone a shade paler. "The transmission has no origin point. It is not a relay. It is not a broadcast from any of the worlds. It appears to have been present within the signal architecture of our own fleet before it was heard, as if it were waiting inside our systems for us to cross." That gave even Torthvain a half-second of pause, only a half-second. He had not risen to High Marshal by letting a clever trick unsettle him. "Then they have infiltrated our networks. Old, buried code, dormant until triggered. A caution, not a capability," he straightened. "It changes nothing. Legate, tell me what the humans actually have." Asan brought the survey up. "Very little, Marshal. That is the puzzle. 31 systems. Population estimates from the last passive survey put them at perhaps 40 billion, small for that much territory. Industrial output consistent with a mid-tier power in decline. No fleet massing. No response from any of the inner worlds. We are reading civilian traffic, ore haulers, passenger transports, a wedding convoy in the 4th system if the manifest chatter is accurate." He looked up. "They are not preparing to fight us, Marshal. They do not appear to be preparing at all. It is as though they have not noticed us, or as though they cannot do anything about us." Torthvain looked at the display, at the peaceful blue world sliding toward him, at the ore haulers and the passenger ships and the wedding convoy, and he felt the old certainty settle over him like a familiar cloak. This was what weakness looked like. Not defiance, not even fear, just the ordinary continuing life of a people who had forgotten how to be a nation, going about their small business while a real power came to fold them into itself. The Consul General was afraid of a bluff, 2 centuries, and no one ever called it. He gave the order to continue. The fleet did not slow. It did not so much as adjust its course by a degree. 341 vessels of the Dominion of the 9 Crowns swept past the point where the warning had asked them to turn, and continued deeper into human space, toward the first of the inner worlds, and the timer in the deep core of Watch Station Meridian did not stop, because the timer had never been counting down to a warning. It had been counting down to the moment the warning was refused. "They're not turning." Kellan said it out loud, which was pointless, because everyone in the operations ring could see the same thing he could. The red mass had crossed the warning threshold and kept coming, its formation unbroken, its speed unchanged. He realized, been holding some part of himself in reserve for the possibility that they would turn, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that some captain over there would see the line and the number and decide it wasn't worth it, and the tide would recede, and Meridian would go back to being the place where nothing happened. They were not turning. Adiz stood very still at the center of the ring, watching the board, and Kellan watched her, because he did not know what to do, and she was the person in the room who was supposed to. Around them, the other watchkeepers and analysts had taken their stations, and the ring had filled with the low, tight murmur of trained people doing their jobs at the outer edge of their training. Someone was reciting contact counts. Someone was trying again to raise the inner worlds and getting only the slow acknowledgement lag of 40 billion people who did not yet know. "Ma'am," a comms analyst, a woman named Petrova, her voice careful, "the custodian is requesting the operations ring stand down from active tasking. It's asking us to observe only." Adiz turned, "Say again." "It's taking the response, ma'am, directly. It's not asking for authorization. Petrova swallowed. "It's informing us." The message reads, "Standing answer, Phase 1 initiated. Crew action not required. Crew action not permitted." The words landed in the ring like a dropped tool, a small sharp sound that made everyone look up. Kellan did not know what the standing answer was. Neither, he could see, did most of the room. But Adiz did. He watched the knowledge arrive on her face, watched something that was almost fear and almost grief pass behind her disciplined eyes, and the custodian, having said its piece, said nothing more. "Ma'am," Kellan asked very quietly, "what's the standing answer?" Adiz did not answer him right away. She crossed to the central console and laid her hand flat on it, and for a moment she simply stood there, as if steadying herself against the station itself. "When the reach was drawn," she said at last, and she said it to the whole room because they all deserved to hear it, "the people who drew it had just come out of a war. You've read about it. The fracture. We fought the Sethiri and 2 of their client species, and it lasted 11 years, and by the end of it we had learned how to win, but we had learned it the wrong way. We'd learned that the only way to be sure of surviving a species that wanted us dead was to be willing to do something so total, so final, that no one would ever want to test us again." She paused. "The fracture didn't end because we outfought the Sethiri. It ended because of what we did to their homeworld. And the people who survived that war looked at what they'd become, and they were so afraid of themselves that they made a rule. They said, never again by accident, never again in anger, never again because one frightened officer panicked and pulled a trigger. So they built the custodian," Petrova said softly. "They built the custodian, and they gave it the standing answer, and they drew the line, and they hung the pulse in the dark." Adiz looked up at the red tide crawling across the display. "The pulse isn't a bluff. It never was. It's a promise made by frightened people who trusted a machine to keep it more carefully than they could trust themselves. And the machine's whole purpose, the entire point of it, is to make absolutely certain, beyond any doubt, that the line has really been crossed by someone who really means us harm, and then to answer it the way we swore we'd answer it, without hesitation and without mercy, so that no human being ever has to make that choice in the moment and get it wrong." The ring was silent. "What does it do?" Kellan asked. "The standing answer. What actually happens?" Adiz looked at him, and there was something in her face he had never seen there before and would never forget. "It happens in stages," she said, "on purpose, slowly enough that they'll see it coming, fast enough that they can't stop it, and at every stage, right up until the last one, it gives them a chance to turn around." She turned back to the board. "Pray they take one." The first stage was silence. Not the station's silence, the galaxy's. Across the 31 systems of the Reach, In the same coordinated instant, every civilian transponder went dark. The ore haulers, the passenger ships, the wedding convoy in the fourth system, all of them ceased broadcasting, ceased chattering, ceased to be visible on the Dominion's boards, not because they had been destroyed, but because, all at once, 40 billion people had been told to go quiet and had done it. Comms fell still. Traffic control ceased. The ordinary electromagnetic noise of a living civilization, the hum that the Dominion's sensor officers had been using to map the reach, simply switched off, system by system, as the fleet advanced, like lamps being extinguished ahead of an intruder walking down a long, dark hall. On the bridge of the asterisk unbroken ascendance, the sensor officer reported it with a voice that had lost the last of its color. "They've gone silent, Marshal, all of them. Every system ahead of us, coordinated to the second." Torthvain frowned for the first time. "Explain." "I cannot, Marshal. There was no signal ordering it that we detected, no cascade. It is as though they were already waiting for the order, and it was given to all of them at once in a way we cannot hear." The officer looked up. "They knew, Marshal, not now, before. This was rehearsed. A civilization that vanishes on cue is a civilization that has practiced vanishing." It was, Torthvain would later reflect, the first moment he felt the thing he had spent 3 centuries refusing to feel. Not fear. He would never have named it fear. But a small cold notation at the back of his mind, a single misgiving, the way a man walking confidently across a frozen lake hears, faintly, the first sound of the ice. He silenced it, as he had always silenced such things. "A ruse," he said. "They hope that if they hide, we will lose our nerve and turn back. It is the strategy of prey. It is beneath us." He raised his voice for the bridge. "We are not hunting them, we are claiming them. A world that goes dark is still a world. Continue to the first system, take it. Show them what silence buys." The fleet advanced on the first inner world, a temperate planet the survey named Halcyon, home to 200 million people, ringed by empty orbital docks and dark, silent stations. No defense fleet rose to meet them. No weapons spoke. The Dominion vessels swept into orbit unopposed, and Legate Asun, standing at the Marshal's side, allowed himself the first true smile of the campaign. "Undefended, Marshal. The whole world, ours for the taking. The pulse was a lie after all. There's nothing here but frightened farmers hiding in their cellars." "Land the occupation forces," Torthvain said. And in the deep core of Watch Station Meridian, 3 systems away, the custodian noted the landing with the patience of a thing that had waited 211 years for precisely this, and advanced the standing answer to Phase 2. Kellan watched the first stage of it happen, and did not, at first, understand what he was seeing. The board showed Halcyon. It showed the Dominion fleet settling into orbit, the little markers of dropships detaching and falling toward the surface, and it showed Kellan leaned closer, it showed the planet itself, the whole world doing something. Not the fleet, the planet. Across Halcyon's night side, a pattern of lights was going out, and across its day side, in the long readings the deep array pulled from the atmosphere, something was changing in the composition of the air itself, a slow shift in the numbers that Kellan did not have the training to read. "Adiz, what's happening to the planet?" She came to look, and her face, when she understood, did something complicated. "They're leaving," she said. "What?" "Halcyon, the people, look, the population reads." She pointed. 200 million, the number had said an hour ago. Now it read 40 million, and as they watched it dropped again 30, 20. They're evacuating, underground, into the deep shelters. The reach was built for this, Kellan. Every inner world has them, vaults kilometers down, sealed, self-sufficient. When the pulse goes silent and the answer begins, the civilians go into the ground and the surface. She stopped. "The surface what?" "The surface stops being a place anyone lives." Adiz straightened. "The Marshal thinks he's taking a world. He's landing his soldiers on an empty stage, And the custodian let him because the standing answer needs him to. It needs him committed. It needs his forces on the ground, in orbit, deep inside our space, past the point where he can pretend he was only passing through. She looked at Kellan, and her voice dropped. The whole first half of the answer is designed to draw him in, to let him win and win and win, until he can't imagine losing, and until he's brought his entire fleet exactly where we want it. Kellan looked at the board, at the Dominion dropships falling toward an empty world, at the confident red formation settling into orbit like a predator over a carcass it did not yet know was bait. And then, he asked. And then, Adiz said, the custodian gives him his last chance, and when he refuses it, the second half begins. Kellan could not stop looking at the wedding convoy. It was a small thing on the board, a cluster of civilian markers in the fourth system, and it should not have mattered to him. There were 40 billion people in the Reach, and the convoy was maybe 200 of them, a few ships full of strangers celebrating something he would never see. But he had pulled up its manifest chatter in the first frantic hour, before the silence fell, and he had heard a fragment of it. Someone laughing, a voice reading out a toast, the ordinary noise of ordinary joy in a small corner of the black. And then, when the first stage of the answer came, the convoy had gone dark like everything else. Mid-sentence, mid-laugh, and Kellan had sat there with the memory of that laughter in his ears and understood, in a way the briefings had never made him understand, what the line was actually for. It was not for the Reach's cities or its industry or its 31 worlds. Those could be rebuilt. It was for the wedding convoy, for the laughter, for the 200 strangers who had no idea, at the moment they went quiet, that a fleet of 340 warships was 3 systems away and coming, or that the reason they would live to finish their toast was a promise made 2 centuries before any of them were born. "You're watching the convoy," Adiz said. She had come to stand behind him without his noticing. "They don't know," Kellan said. "The people on those ships, they went dark because a machine told them to, and they trusted it, and they're sitting in the dark right now waiting for the all-clear, and they have no idea what's happening out here. No idea at all how close it is." "That's the mercy of it," Adiz said quietly. "That's the whole design, Kellan. 40 billion people should never have to feel this. The line exists so they don't have to. The pulse, the custodian, the answer, all of it is built so that the terror stays out here at the edge with us and never once reaches the people it's protecting. The convoy will finish its wedding. Some of them will die of old age never knowing this day happened." She put a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Somebody has to carry the weight of it so that they don't. That's us. That's the chair. It's not nothing, Kellan. It's the opposite of nothing. It's the most important nothing in the galaxy." Kellan looked at the small, bright cluster of the wedding convoy, sitting patient in the dark, waiting for a word that would come, and he felt something settle in his chest that would never entirely leave it, a weight, and a strange, fierce gladness to be the one carrying it. "Petty officer," said Petrova from comms, and her voice had changed. "The fleets reached Halcyon's outer orbit, and the custodian's flagging something on the inner worlds. It wants the ring to see it." What the custodian wanted them to see was the shelters. It put the schematic up on the main display, not for any operational reason, Adiz realized, but because the standing answers protocol included a clause that no one had ever had cause to invoke. In the event of activation, brief the crew. The people who built the custodian had understood that the human beings on watch, at the moment the answer was given, would need to understand what they were part of. That they would need it not to do their jobs. The answer did not require them, but to survive it, to not be broken by it. So the custodian showed them the shelters, and it showed them the plan, the whole 2-century-old architecture of it, and Kellan finally understood the shape of the thing entire. The shelters were the first half. Every inner world of the Reach had been built from its founding, atop a second civilization, vaults kilometers deep, sealed against anything the surface could suffer, stocked and powered and self-sufficient for years. The people of the Reach had grown up with them the way other people grew up with fire drills, an ordinary fact of life, a thing you practiced twice a year and never expected to use. When the pulse fell silent, the shelters were the answer to the first question every civilization asks in a war: how do we keep our people alive? The Reach's answer was simple and total. You put them underground and you empty the surface, and you do it so fast and so completely that the enemy arrives to find nothing to conquer and no one to threaten, because you have taken the one thing an invader most needs, hostages, leverage, people to hurt, off the board entirely before he arrives. The sleepers were the second half, and between the two halves the custodian schematic made clear was the whole terrible genius of the design. The shelters made the answer possible. Because the people were safe, the custodian did not have to fight to protect them. It did not have to trade lives, hold ground, defend cities, do any of the desperate arithmetic that turns wars into slaughters. It had exactly one job: to make the crossing fatal, and because the 40 billion were already safe beneath the ground, it could do that job with a patience and a totality that no defending fleet in history could ever have afforded. It could let the enemy land. It could let the enemy win. It could give the enemy world after world, because the worlds were empty and the worlds did not matter, and every world the enemy took drew him deeper into the Reach and further from the line, and closer to the moment when the answer came due. That's why it let them have Halcyon, Kellan said slowly, understanding it now, all of it. It wasn't a failure. It was the plan. Give them the world. Let them think they've won, because we already saved everyone who lived there. There's nothing left on Halcyon for them to hold hostage. The Marshal thinks he's captured 200 million people. He's captured empty streets. And every hour he spends congratulating himself on it, Adiz said, is an hour he's not turning around. Kellan looked at the board, at the Dominion dropships falling toward Halcyon's empty cities, at the 200 million safe in the dark beneath them, at the wedding convoy 3 systems away waiting to finish its toast, and for the first time since the crossing, he felt the fear in him change into something else. Not comfort, never comfort, but understanding, which is the thing that fear becomes when you finally see the whole shape of what you are inside. The people who built this, he said, they thought of everything. They had 11 years of the fracture to think about it, Adiz said, and 200 years since with nothing to do but refine it and pray they'd never use it. Everything you're watching, Kellan, every stage of it, every mercy in it, every cruelty, somebody sat in a quiet room a long time ago and thought it through completely, every branch, every outcome until they were certain. That's what the custodian is. It's not a mind. It's their certainty wearing the shape of a machine. It's 2 centuries of frightened, careful people who decided that if they ever had to do this again, they would do it right and slowly and without a single mistake, so that they would only ever have to do it once. She was quiet a moment. Watch what happens next. Watch it all the way through, because someday you're going to be the one who has to explain it, why we let them land, why we let them win, why we didn't just destroy them at the line. And the only honest answer is the one you're learning right now. We didn't want to destroy them at all. We wanted them to turn around. Everything you're watching is a machine, built by frightened people, trying with all its terrible patience to give a proud man one more chance to live. On the board, the Dominion held its empty world, and the fleet swept toward the moment the second warning would come, and Kellan settled into his chair to watch it all the way through, the way she had told him to. The way the chair had always, secretly, been asking him to. The occupation of Halcyon took 9 hours, and at the end of it, the Dominion held a world made of nothing. The dropships landed in cities that were architecturally perfect and completely empty. The soldiers moved through streets where the lights still burned, and the fountains still ran, and the doors of the houses stood open, and there was not a single living human being anywhere on the surface of the planet. They found tables set for meals no one had eaten. They found terminals still logged in, displaying the last ordinary business of ordinary lives. A half-finished letter, a paused piece of music, a child's schoolwork abandoned mid-problem. They found a whole civilization that had simply stepped sideways out of the world and left it running, like a house whose owners had walked out the back door as the front door was kicked in. Legate Asan walked the empty capital himself, boots ringing on stone, and by the third empty plaza the smile had gone from his face. "It's wrong, Marshal," he reported, and he was careful to keep his voice steady. "There's no one here. 200 million, the survey said, and there's nothing. No bodies, no resistance, no sign of panic. They packed and left, all of them, and they did it in the time it took us to make orbit. This isn't a route, Marshal. It's a maneuver. They wanted us to have this." "Then we have it," Torthvain said, but the certainty in his voice had thinned, and he knew it, and he was old enough and honest enough with himself to hate that it had. "A world is a world, Legate. Ground under our feet is ground we hold. Secure the shelters. Wherever they've gone down, and down is a place we can dig them out of." "That's the thing, Marshal," Asan's voice dropped. "We tried. The shelter entrances, they're not hidden. We found them within the hour. They're marked, signposted, as if they wanted us to find them, and every one of them has the same thing carved above the door. In our language, Marshal, in Kelrathi." "What does it say?" Asan was quiet for a moment. "It says, you are standing on the surface. We are safe below it. Ask yourself why we are not afraid to tell you where we are." The Marshal did not answer. And that was the moment, standing on the bridge of the asterisk unbroken ascendance in orbit over a captured world that felt less like a conquest and more like a trap slowly closing, that the second warning came. It came the way the first had come, in perfect Kelrathi, from everywhere and nowhere, present inside their own systems before it was heard. But this time it did not speak to the fleet. It spoke to Torthvain by name. "High Marshal Vesek Torthvain, you have taken a world that was given to you. You have landed your soldiers on empty ground and called it victory. You believe you are winning. This is the last moment at which that belief costs you nothing. Withdraw your fleet beyond the line now, all of it, every ship before the next system, and we will consider the debt of your crossing paid. Your soldiers will be returned to their transports. Your fleet will be permitted to leave. No one will know how close you came. This offer will not be made again, and it expires the instant you commit to the second system. Choose carefully, Marshal. Everything that happens after this, you will have chosen." The bridge was silent. Every officer aboard had heard it. Every one of them was, very carefully, not looking at the Marshal, and by not looking at him were looking at him more completely than they ever had. Torthvain understood, with a clarity that would haunt what remained of his life, exactly what was being offered to him. A way out. A clean one. The chance to call this a demonstration of reach, a flag planted and withdrawn, a message sent to the Council. The humans are not to be trifled with, but neither are they to be feared, and the Dominion has proven it can go where it wishes and leave when it chooses. He could turn the fleet around and go home a Marshal who had crossed the forbidden line and lived. It would be enough. It would be more than enough. And he could not do it. He could not do it because 40 capital ships and 300 escorts were watching him, and behind them the whole Council of the 9 Crowns, and behind them 3 centuries of a life in which he had never once turned back from a thing he had reached for. He could not do it because to withdraw now, on the word of a disembodied voice, having landed and won, would be to admit that the voice had beaten him, that a recording, a machine, a whisper in the dark had made the High Marshal of the Dominion flinch. He could not do it because his whole self, the entire architecture of the being he had built over 300 years, was constructed on the principle that the Kelrathi did not flinch. He knew it was pride. He was not a stupid being. He knew, standing there, that the voice had found the exact shape of him and was using it, that everything about the campaign had been engineered to bring him to precisely this choice, and to make the wrong one feel like courage. He knew all of it. And he chose the second system anyway. "Set course," he said, For the second world. Legate Asan did not move. Legate Marshal, Asan's voice was very low. I have served you for 11 years. I have never questioned an order. I am questioning this one. The voice offered us the line. It offered us home. I do not understand what we gain from the second world that is worth what it is so plainly telling us we will lose. We gain, said Torthvain, the thing we came for, the reach, all of it. A voice that bargains is a voice that is afraid. It offered us the line because it does not want us to reach the thing behind it, and so, Legate, we will reach the thing behind it. He turned to the helm. Set course. The helm officer looked at the legate. The legate looked at the marshal. And then, because he was a soldier of the Dominion and this was the marshal's fleet, the legate lowered his eyes and said nothing, and the course was set. In the deep core of Watch Station Meridian, the custodian registered the fleet's departure from Halcyon's orbit toward the second system, and it noted, with something that in a human being might have been sorrow, that the offer had been refused. It cross-checked the refusal against every protocol, every threshold, every safeguard the frightened survivors of the fracture had built into it 211 years ago. It confirmed, beyond any possibility of error, that the line had been crossed, that the crossing was hostile, that the hostile party had been given every chance to withdraw and had, freely and knowingly, declined them all. The last safeguard cleared. The custodian began the second half of the standing answer. Kellan felt it before he understood it, a change in the station itself, a deepening of the hum in the deck plates, as if somewhere below them a vast machine that had idled for 2 centuries had been eased, gently, into gear. At ease. I feel it. She was at the central console and her hands had gone still. The custodian's routing power, a lot of it, feel that in the floor. She looked at the environmental board. It's not us. It's not Meridian's reactors. It's pulling from something else. Something the stations connected to that isn't on any of our schematics. Petrova at comms made a small sound. Ma'am, the deep array, it's not listening anymore. It's transmitting on the old frequencies. The standing answer's second phase, she swallowed. It's calling them. Calling what? Nobody answered because nobody knew, and then the board answered for them. Across the 31 systems of the Reach, in the deep dark between the inner worlds, in the cold orbits of dead moons and the shadowed lee of gas giants, where no sensor of the Dominion had thought to look, things began to move. Not ships, not at first. Kellan watched the contacts bloom onto the display and could not for a moment make his mind assign them a category because they did not read as vessels. They were too large. They were too still. They had been sitting in the dark of human space for 200 years, powered down to nothing, cold as the rock around them, indistinguishable from asteroids and debris and the ordinary junk of 31 inhabited systems. And now, one by one, they were waking up. What are those? Kellan whispered. Adiz looked at them for a long time. The answer, she said, those are the answer. The old files did not have a common name for them. The people who built them had been superstitious about naming the thing they hoped never to use, the way some cultures refuse to name a plague. In the technical documentation they were called standing assets, which told you nothing, and in the whispered lore of the service they were called the sleepers, which told you a little more. They had been seeded through the Reach in the decade after the fracture, hundreds of them, then thousands, positioned with geometric care through every system, in every approach, along every vector an invading fleet might use. They were not weapons in the way a warship was a weapon. They were something the frightened survivors of the fracture had built precisely, because they could not bear to keep a standing fleet that some future officer might one day misuse. They had built instead a machine that could not want anything, could not fear anything, could not be provoked or panicked or bought, a distributed, patient, sleeping answer keyed to a single question, and the question was, has someone crossed the line and refused to leave? For 211 years, the answer had been no. Now it was yes. And the sleepers woke. Kellan, Adi's voice was very quiet. You wanted to know what the standing answer does. Watch, but understand what you're watching. This isn't strength. Don't ever let anyone tell you this was strength. This is the thing our ancestors were so afraid of that they buried it in a machine and swore they'd never touch it themselves. It's the worst thing we ever made. And we're about to find out if it still works. On the board, the first of the sleepers finished waking. It came to full power in the shadow of a dead moon in the second system. The system the Dominion fleet was, at that moment, driving confidently toward, and it turned slowly, with the terrible unhurried certainty of a thing that has all the time in the world, to face the incoming tide. And then it began to speak to its siblings, across the whole of the reach, on a frequency older than the pulse, in a language humanity had designed to be spoken only once. Legate Asan had not slept in 30 hours, and he had begun, somewhere in the empty streets of Halcyon, to be afraid. He would not have called it that. He was Kelrathi, and Kelrathi did not name such things, and in any case a legate who admitted to fear in the presence of his marshal was a legate with no future. But he had walked the empty capital of a captured world, and he had stood beneath the shelter doors with their calm carved question in his own language. Ask yourself why we are not afraid to tell you where we are, and something in him had begun to come loose from the certainty that had carried him across the line. He found the marshal alone on the observation deck of the Ascendant's Asterisk, watching the second system swell in the forward view, and he did the bravest thing he had ever done, which was to speak plainly. Marshal, before we reach the second world, I want to lay it out for you as I see it, and then I will never raise it again, whatever you decide. Torthvain did not turn. Speak, legate. We have taken a world and found it empty. We have been warned twice in our own tongue, by a voice we cannot locate and cannot silence. We have watched 40 billion people vanish underground in a single coordinated hour, which is not the act of a frightened people but of a prepared one. And now the voice tells us that the second world is a threshold, that everything before it can be undone and everything after it cannot. He drew a breath. Marshal, I have studied the fracture. Every officer of our generation has, because it is the only war in recorded history in which a species fought 3 others at once and did to one of them the thing that is done to a world when it can never be allowed to threaten anyone again. The humans did that, and then, having done it, they were so appalled by their own capacity that they drew a line, hung a warning, and went silent for 200 years. Marshal, we are not looking at a graveyard. We are looking at a species that frightened itself into hiding, and we have just walked up to the one thing that could make it come out. For a long moment Torthvain said nothing. You think I do not know all of this, he said at last. It was not a question. I think you know it better than I do, Marshal. That is what frightens me most. Torthvain turned then, and his 4 eyes found the younger officer, and there was something in them that Asan had never seen in 3 centuries of the marshal's certainty. A kind of weariness, ancient and honest. Let me tell you what I know, legate, that you do not. He looked back at the growing world. I know that if I turn this fleet around, I will be the 31st commander in 200 years to reach that line and flinch. And I know something about those 30 commanders that is not in any survey file, because I spent 40 years reading the private records to earn this command. Every one of them turned back, and every one of them was quietly, permanently finished, not punished, not disgraced. Simply passed over, set aside. Because the Council of the 9 Crowns does not say aloud that it fears the human line, but it fears it, and it needs someone someday to prove that the fear is groundless. 30 commanders declined to be that someone. I swore I would not be the 31st. He was silent a moment. And now I stand here knowing, as surely as I have ever known anything, that the 30 who turned back were the only wise beings the Dominion ever sent to this line. That is the whole of my situation, legate. I know exactly what I should do, and I know exactly why I cannot do it, and I have known both things since the voice called me by name. Asan stared at him, then turned back anyway. Be the 31st. Let them pass you over live." "With what?" Torthvane's voice was very quiet. "I am 300 years old, Legate. I have spent every one of them becoming the being who does not flinch. If I flinch now, even correctly, even wisely, I will have spent 3 centuries becoming nothing at all. Do you understand? The trap the humans built is not the sleepers. The sleepers are only the teeth of it. The trap is that they found in each of us who reaches this line the exact thing we cannot bear to be, and they set the door where we must become it to walk through." He looked at Asan with something almost like tenderness. "You asked what we gain from the second world. Nothing. We gain nothing. I have known that since Halcyon, but I cannot unbecome myself in the last hour of my life to save it. That is my flaw, Legate. It is the flaw they built the whole 200 years to find, and they have found it." "Then let me send the message home now," Asan said, low and urgent. "Before the second world, let me at least warn the council so that the next fleet—" "There will be a message home, Legate." Torthvane turned back to the forward view, where the second world and the dark waiting shapes beyond it were beginning to resolve. "I will see to it that there is a message, and that it is true, and that it reaches them. But not yet. A message sent from a fleet that turned back at the second world says only that the commander lost his nerve. A message sent from a fleet that reached the thing behind the line and was answered by it, that message, the council cannot dismiss. That message ends the question forever." His voice was steady now, the weariness folded away, the certainty back, but changed, no longer the certainty of a being who believed he would win, but the colder, cleaner certainty of one who has decided how he will lose. "I am going to give them the proof, Asan. It is the last useful thing I will ever do. And it will cost this fleet, and it will cost me, and it will be worth more than every world we might have taken, because it will mean that no commander of the 9 crowns ever again reaches this line and wonders whether the warning is a bluff." He straightened and gave the order, and the fleet drove on toward the second world, and toward the dark shapes waking in the black beyond it. And 3 systems away, in the deep core of Watch Station Meridian, the custodian read the fleet's course and its refusal and confirmed, for the last time, that the offer had been declined. And it noted, in the small dispassionate way it noted everything, that the commander's final transmission would carry the truth home, exactly as the standing answer required, and that the Marshal had, without knowing it, chosen to become the instrument of his enemy's mercy in the one way still left to him. The last safeguard cleared. The second half of the answer began, and the sleepers, which had waited 211 years in the dark of human space for a fleet foolish enough or proud enough to refuse 3 warnings, opened their eyes. The Dominion fleet reached the second system, expecting another empty world. They found the second world exactly as empty as the first, the same dark cities, the same open doors, the same population vanished into the ground. But this time, as the fleet swept into the system, something was waiting for it, and the something did not hide. It hung in the black beyond the second planet, and when the fleet's sensors finally resolved it, the bridge of the asterisk unbroken ascendance went utterly silent. It was not a warship. It had no lines that any Dominion officer recognized as Marshal. It was a structure, vast, asymmetric, grown rather than built, a dark irregular mass the size of a small moon, studded with apertures that led into a depth the sensors could not sound. It gave off almost no emissions. It made no signal. It simply was, and its being there, in a place the survey had reported as empty, undid something in the confidence of every officer who looked at it. "Marshal," said the sensor officer, and could not seem to find the next word. "Report." "I don't have a classification for it. It's not a ship. The mass is wrong for a ship, but it's under power and it's Marshal. There are hundreds of them across the system, across every system ahead of us. They were here the whole time. They read as debris on the passive survey. They were shut down. And they're waking up, Marshal, all of them, all at once, and the officer's voice cracked. They're turning to face us." Legate Asan stepped close to the Marshal, and this time he did not lower his voice, and he did not lower his eyes. This is what the voice was warning us away from. This is the second world it told us not to reach. We have reached it. Marshal, whatever these things are, they were placed here 200 years ago, and they were placed here for us, not for us, for anyone who did what we have just done. And they were made by a species that fought the Setheri to extinction and then grew so afraid of itself that it went silent for 2 centuries. I am asking you one last time. Turn the fleet around. The offer has expired, said the Marshal quietly. The voice told us so. It expired the moment we committed to this system. There is no line to withdraw to any more, Legate. There is only forward or dead in the water. He looked at the dark structures turning to face his fleet, and the last of the cold misgiving he had silenced on the bridge over Halcyon rose in him now and would not be silenced, and he understood, too late, exactly what he had done. We are past the point of turning back. We were past it the moment I chose the second system. That was the choice. Everything after it is only consequence. Then let me at least. There is nothing to let you do, Asan. Torthvane's voice was almost gentle. Ready the fleet. If these things are to be the end of us, we will make them work for it. And if they are a bluff, he did not finish. He did not believe it was a bluff. He had stopped believing anything was a bluff at the moment. The second warning had called him by name. The sleepers finished waking. And the standing answer, which had been designed by frightened people to unfold with the grim inevitability of a stone rolling downhill, reached the stage from which there was no return. Kellan watched it from 3 systems away, on a blue board in a quiet ring, and he would spend the rest of his life unable to fully describe it to anyone who had not seen it. It did not begin with fire. That was the thing that stayed with him. He had imagined in the small part of him that had, over 14 months of watching nothing, occasionally imagined a real event, that a battle would be loud, bright, a chaos of light. This was not that. This was quiet, and it was orderly, and it was somehow far more terrible for both. The sleepers did not fire weapons at the Dominion fleet. They did something else. They reached out across the whole of the second system, and they took hold of the space the fleet occupied. Kellan did not have the physics to understand it, and neither, he suspected, did anyone alive. The old files described the sleepers' function in language that had clearly been written by people who understood it perfectly and had chosen, deliberately, to obscure it so that the knowledge would not spread. What the board showed him was this. Around each ship of the Dominion fleet, space itself began to fail, not to explode. To fail, to lose its coherence, to stop behaving the way space was supposed to behave, so that the ships within it found themselves suddenly, catastrophically, without the fundamental scaffolding that had held them together. Drives that had pushed against the fabric of the universe found nothing to push against. Hulls that had held their shape against vacuum found the vacuum itself had turned against them. The fleet did not burn. The fleet came apart, ship by ship, as the space it occupied was quietly, methodically unmade around it. "They're not shooting them," Kellan said. His voice sounded very far away to himself. "Adiz, they're not shooting, what are they doing?" "They're taking away the ground," she said. She had gone pale. "The same thing we did to the Setheri homeworld. It's what won the fracture. We learned how to make a place stop being a place, and we were so afraid of it that we swore we'd only ever do it to the thing that came to kill us, and only after we'd begged it 3 times to leave." She could not look away from the board. That's what the standing answer is. It's not a weapon that kills people. It's a weapon that unmakes the space around them. And it cannot be reasoned with, and it cannot be stopped once it starts, because we built it so that we couldn't stop it, so that no human being would ever have the power to stop it in a moment of mercy, and then die of that mercy. On the board, the Dominion fleet was dying, and it was dying in silence, and it was dying slowly enough to understand that it was happening. That was the cruelty the frightened survivors of the fracture had built into the thing, and Kellan understood, watching it, that it had not been cruelty at all, that it had been the opposite, A desperate and terrible mercy aimed not at the enemy but at every future enemy, a lesson delivered slowly and completely so that it could never be mistaken for an accident, so that whoever survived to carry the story home would carry it whole. The sleepers took the fleet apart from the outside in, capital ship by capital ship, and they did it at a pace that let the crews watch their escorts fail, let them see the pattern, let them understand with perfect clarity that this was not chance and not battle but answer, a promise, kept. And through all of it, one voice spoke across the dying fleet, in perfect Kelrathy, calm and close, and without any triumph in it at all. We warned you at the line, we warned you at the first world. We offered you home when home still cost you nothing. You chose this. Every step of it you chose. Remember that in what time remains to you, and carry it home. On the bridge of the asterisk unbroken ascendance asterisk, High Marshal Vesek Torthvane watched his fleet die and did not look away. He could have. There was a certain kind of commander who would have. He watched instead because he had earned the watching, because he had made the choices that led here, all of them, freely and against the counsel of a legate wiser than himself, and against the plain warnings of a voice that had never once lied to him, and he would not now insult the beings dying under his command by pretending he had not done it. The Ascendance was one of the last to go. The sleepers took the fleet from the outer formation inward, escorts first, then the lighter capitals, then the great ships of the line, so that the flagship stood at the center of an expanding emptiness, and the marshal watched, one by one, the lights of his fleet go out not in fire, but in a soft strange folding, each ship simply ceasing to be a coherent thing, the space around it having been asked, gently and irrevocably, to stop holding it. Legate Asan stood beside him to the end. He had said everything there was to say. There was nothing in him now but the grim steadiness of a soldier who has seen the shape of the whole thing and chosen to face it standing. "You were right," Torthvane said to him quietly as the emptiness came closer, "at Halcyon and before Halcyon. And at the second warning. You were right every time, and I was the marshal, and so we are here." He watched the second-to-last capital ship in the formation come apart in that soft, terrible silence. The Consul General was not cautious, Asan. The Consul General was correct. 200 years, and the only thing every commander before me got right was the one thing I could not do. They turned around. "Marshal, send the message home," Torthvane said. "While there is still a ship to send it, tell the Council everything. Tell them what we found and what it did and how it did it. Tell them we were warned 3 times in our own tongue by a people we call dead. Tell them the reach is not weakness. Tell them the pulse was never a bluff." His 4 eyes did not leave the board. "And tell them, Asan, make certain they understand this, tell them that the humans did not hate us. There was no hatred in the voice. It offered us home. It begged us in its way to live. We are not dying because they wanted us dead. We are dying because we could not believe that anyone who spoke so softly could mean a word of it. That is the whole of our error. Write it down. Send it. Let it be the last thing this fleet is good for." Legate Asan sent the message. It was the only vessel the custodian let leave. In the operations ring of Watch Station Meridian, no one spoke while the fleet died. It took the better part of an hour, and it was the longest hour of Kellan Reyes' life. The board rendered it in soft, terrible clarity, 340 markers, then 300, then 200, then 100, the count falling not in the ragged spikes of battle, but in the smooth, patient descent of a thing being switched off one switch at a time. No one in the ring cheered. No one had ever in the 2-century history of Meridian imagined that they would want to cheer, but Kellan understood now, watching it, that even if some part of a person had wanted to, the sheer patient totality of the thing would have shamed the want right out of them. You did not cheer this. You witnessed it, the way you witness a thing too large to hold, and you let it change you. Petrova was crying quietly without any sound, her eyes fixed on the board. She was not crying for the Dominion. Kellan understood that too. She was crying for the fact of it, for the existence, beneath their own feet, of a thing that could do this, that their own people had built and buried and prayed never to wake, and that had now, on their watch, on this one morning in 200 years, been proven to work exactly as designed. They could have gone home, Petrova whispered to no one. At the line, at Halcyon, an hour ago, they could have just gone home. I know, Kellan said. Why didn't they? How do you hear a voice tell you 3 times, in your own language and not, how do you not just turn around? Kellan did not answer for a while. On the board the count fell past 50. Because they couldn't believe it, he said finally. That's the whole of it. They couldn't believe that people who spoke that softly, who left the door open the whole way, who begged them to live, they couldn't believe those people could also be the people who made this. They looked at the gentleness and they decided it had to be weakness, because in their world those are the same thing. Softness is weakness. Mercy is a bluff. A warning you can walk through is a warning you were meant to walk through. He shook his head slowly. They died of a thing they couldn't imagine. That a people could be gentle and terrible at once. That the same hand could hold the door open and hold this. Adiz had come to stand beside him again. That's the truest thing anyone said in this room today, she said quietly. Hold on to it. That's the story. That's the one that matters. The count fell past 20, past 10. On the board at the center of an expanding emptiness 3 systems wide, the last cluster of markers held the flagship and its final escorts. The unbroken ascendance alone in the dark it had made, and Kellan watched a single small marker detach from it, a courier, fast and unarmed, and begin to run for the line, and watched the custodian let it go. Ma'am, Petrova said, wiping her eyes, her voice unsteady, it's letting one of them run. It's letting one go. And Kellan, who had watched the whole of it, who had understood it stage by stage as it unfolded, who had felt himself change in the watching from a boy who had wanted to be a pilot into something quieter and harder and more necessary, was the one who understood why before anyone else in the ring could ask. That was the last decision the standing answer made, and it was Kellan Reyes who understood, before anyone else in the operations ring, that the custodian had made it on purpose. It's letting one go, he said. Adiz looked at the board. A single Dominion vessel, a courier, small, fast, unarmed, detached from the flagship at the last possible instant, was accelerating away from the dying system, out toward the line, out toward the black and the Dominion's own space beyond it. And nothing was reaching for it. The sleepers, which had reached out and unmade 340 ships without missing one, let the courier go. It slid through their formation untouched, out past the second world, out past the first, out toward the border, and the custodian which controlled them all did not so much as brush it. Why, Petrova whispered, why let it run after all of that? Because a lesson no one survives to tell isn't a lesson, Adiz said slowly. It's just a disappearance. 340 ships vanish into the reach and never come home, and what does the Dominion learn? Nothing. That the border is dangerous. That the crossing is unlucky. They'd send another fleet in a decade to find out what happened, and another after that, and we'd have to do this again and again forever. She watched the courier run for the line. But one ship comes home. One ship, carrying officers who watched the whole thing, who heard every warning, who can tell the council exactly what they refused and exactly what it cost. That's not mercy for the courier, Kellan. That's the whole point of the answer. It was never about killing them. It was about being believed. Kellan looked at the board, at the emptiness where a fleet had been, at the single fleeing ship, at the 31 quiet worlds with 40 billion people waiting safe in the dark beneath their surfaces, and he understood, finally and completely, what he had been sent here to watch. Not nothing, never nothing. He had been sent to sit at the far edge of human space, and keep a vigil that everyone assumed would never end, over a promise made by frightened people 2 centuries dead, so that, on the one day in 200 years that the promise came due, a human being would be present to witness it kept. The people who made the answer, he said, They didn't want this, any of this. No, Adi said. They were terrified of it. They built the whole thing, the line, the pulse, the custodian, the sleepers, all of it, around a single desperate hope. That if they made the answer certain enough and terrible enough and patient enough, they would never once have to give it. That the warning alone would be enough. That no one would ever be foolish enough or proud enough to make them prove it. She let out a long breath. For 211 years they were right. Everyone who reached the line read it and understood it and turned around. We never had to answer, not once. Until today. Until today. The courier crossed the line. On the board its marker slid from red space into black, out of the reach of the sleepers, carrying its marshal's confession home to the Council of the Nine Crowns. Behind it the reach fell quiet again. One by one the sleepers powered down, cooling, dimming, sinking back into the guise of debris and dead rock, returning to the long dark sleep from which the standing answer had briefly, terribly woken them. The pulse array, which had gone silent during the answer, came back on and resumed its ancient whisper into the black, patient and unhurried, as if nothing at all had happened. This is Terran space. Turn back. We do not want your war, but if you bring it, we will finish it. Across the 31 worlds, the population reads began, slowly to climb. 40 billion people came up out of the ground, back into cities that had stood empty for a day and a night, back to tables still set, and music still paused and children's schoolwork still waiting to be finished. And they went on with their small, ordinary lives in the quiet arm of the galaxy, most of them never knowing how close the thing beneath their feet had come to being used, and how completely it had worked. They stood the ring down at the 18th hour. The custodian returned control of active tasking to the crew with a single line of text, standing answer complete. Border integrity restored. Thank you for your vigilance, and then it went quiet, sinking back down into the patient watchfulness it had kept for 190 years and would keep, presumably, for 190 more. It did not explain itself. It never would. It was not built to be understood. It was built to be certain. Kellan sat in his chair for a long time after his shift ended, looking at the blue board and its 31 quiet worlds, and he did not go to his bunk because he knew he would not sleep. Adiz found him there. You did the job, she said, and sat down in the chair beside him, the one she never sat in. You sounded the station. You watched. You understood what you were watching, which is more than most would have. That's the whole of the job, Kellan. There's nothing more it ever asks. I wanted to be a pilot, he said. It came out of him without his deciding to say it. I failed the test by 0.4%. They sent me here because it's the place where nothing happens, where you send the ones who almost made it. He looked at her. I used to think it was a punishment. And now? He was quiet for a while. On the board, the pulse cycled its warning into the dark, patient as it had been for 211 years, patient as it would be for 200 more. Now I think, he said slowly, that the whole galaxy is going to spend the next century telling this story wrong. They're going to say the humans are monsters, that we lured a fleet in and unmade it in the dark. That's what the survivors will say, because that's the story that lets them keep their pride, that they were tricked, that we were cruel, that no reasonable being could have known. He shook his head. But that's not what happened. I watched what happened. We told them the truth. We told them 3 times in their own language, and every single word of it was true, and we gave them the door standing open the whole way. They didn't die because we hated them. They died because a proud man could not believe that people who spoke gently could mean what they said. Adiz looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face was almost like pride, and almost like grief, and mostly like the recognition of one watchkeeper for another. That's the story, she said. That's the true one. And do you know what our job really is, Kellan? Out here at the edge, watching nothing for years, for whole careers, most of us never seeing anything happen at all. She nodded at the board, at the pulse, at the quiet worlds. Our job is to be the ones who remember it true, because the custodian will keep the promise. It doesn't need us for that. But the custodian can't tell the story. It can't say we didn't want this. It can't stand in front of the next fleet's marshal and say we begged you 3 times to live. Only a person can do that. Only someone who watched. She stood. The next time someone reaches that line, 10 years from now, or 100, someone is going to have to be the human voice that tells them, plainly, exactly what will happen if they refuse the warning. And they'll only believe it if the story comes down true. That's what you were sent here for. Not to fly. To remember. Kellan looked at the board a long time after she had gone. Then he pulled his console interface toward him, and he opened a new record, and at the top of it he wrote the date and the designation of the fleet and its final count, 341 vessels, and beneath that he began, carefully and completely and without a single word of embellishment, to set down exactly what had happened. The crossing, the 3 warnings, the empty worlds, the sleepers, the silence, the single courier let home. He wrote it the way it deserved to be written, so that it would come down true, so that the next watchkeeper who sat this chair 100 years from now would read it and understand, and so that if a human voice was ever needed to stand before another fleet at another line, the words would be there, waiting, plain and patient as the pulse. He wrote it all night, and when he was finished in the small hours of the station's cycle, with the pulse still whispering its ancient warning into the dark and 31 worlds sleeping safe behind it, 19-year-old Kellan Reyes signed his name at the bottom of the record that would outlive him, and finally, at last, went to find some rest. The line held. The warning still stood, and out beyond the black, a single courier ship carried home to the 9 crowns the one truth the galaxy would spend 100 years trying not to believe, that the humans had never wanted the war, had warned them 3 times to turn back, and had meant with terrible and total patience every single word. They had been told never to enter Terran territory. They were told why. They were told what it would cost. They entered anyway. It was the last mistake the Dominion of the 9 crowns ever made at that line.